He'll go to Jonesboro with me.
All right, we're ready to go. You can put your hand.
I'll take it off if you pray.
Well, we'll do that here in just a second.
Okay.
We're going to finish our study of the 12 apostles plus 3 other guys. Actually, I think my note says plus 4 because we've got Matthias in there. And we'll finish that today. I don't expect us to take the whole hour and a half because unless you guys have a lot of questions or observations or comments to make, we're just going to run through these guys that we didn't cover last week. This will be our last class for a month, I guess. We start back September 20th. Will be the first class for our New Testament survey class. And we'll begin then. And so you've got several weeks where you don't have to commit to Mondays. Find something exciting to do. And those of you who may be watching online, pay attention to that, please, that we will not meet again until September the 20th. And then we'll meet, you guys won't actually meet until Thursday, the 23rd, or whatever, 28th, 23rd.
This is going to be the 20th.
20th, 23rd, right?
This is gonna be at night though, the Monday.
This one's gonna be at night. That's why I'm saying that.
It'll be 3 days later.
Yeah, which would be
24.
23rd. 20th to the 20 plus
okay.
3. Let's do this together. 20 plus 3
Is
23. So it's the 23rd. Okay. Yeah, but yeah, watch it, Chi-Chi.
I feel like I'm in Sunday.
That's what everybody was doing. Thinking, wait a minute. 20 plus 3 is 23. So if the 20th is right, 23rd is right.
20th right.
20th is right. Thank you, John. But the Monday night class is going to be Monday night. The Monday class is a Monday evening because I'm going to be taking an ETSU class on Thursday nights.
At what time?
6 o'clock. And so the Monday class will be at 6, and then the Thursday afternoon class will be at 2. You're welcome to come to either one. If you want the afternoon, it'll be 2 o'clock Thursdays. If you want to meet 6 to 7:30, we'll be meeting Mondays from 6 to 7:30. And you're welcome to either one. Like we've always done, they'll pretty much mirror each other, so whichever one you want to come to is fine. The New Testament survey class, as I'm working on it now, probably going to easily be 12 classes. And so we're looking at ending up sometime the first or second week in December if everything works well. We'll have a couple of Mondays in there, at least one. Well, I'll be out of town, so we won't have a class that week. But then we should still end up somewhere around the second week in December. Y'all guys can still be here then? So whichever one of those you want to go to is fine with me. We'll have a lot of handouts like we did for the Old Testament survey class. A lot of stuff to cover. The first 2 classes will be primarily an introduction to the New Testament. What life was like during that time span. So we get a context for the scriptures, context for what was going on, and I'm looking at that's probably a 2-day, 2-class introductory class. And then we'll get into the books. It'll be a survey class like we did the Old Testament where we won't really get deeply into the books, but we'll spend some time looking at every one of them, seeing how they all fit together. So I encourage you, invite you, hope you'll come to some of those, and maybe we'll get some more of our church members to come to those as well. New Testament, probably to most of us, more important than the Old Testament because it's all about Christianity, things that you and I are supposed to be living by. And that's not to say the Old Testament isn't important because I think it is, and I think we need to understand it better than what most of us do. But the New Testament hopefully will be something that will be of interest to you as well. And with that, we'll go to God in prayer and get our class started today. God, we thank you for loving us. We thank you for all that you do for us. Father, I thank you for each one that's here today. I pray that you would be with this class. Let your Spirit guide our discussion, our comments, things you want us to learn. God, I pray that as we study these men who gave their lives for the purpose of spreading the gospel, that you'll help us to appreciate them more. You'll help us to appreciate the opportunities that you give us to share the gospel. And we'll take advantage of those opportunities ourselves. God, thank you for all that you do for us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Last week we started looking at the 12 apostles. I got through page 5 of your handout. We're up to Thomas. You've got a second handout that I gave you because I tried to make that little symbol darker. It was a pale yellow on my original, so when it copied, it didn't copy very well, and it didn't even show up too well on the handout that I gave you, but better, I think, maybe than it was. And I added some stuff for Thomas. I don't know why I didn't have anything in there for Thomas to begin with. For some reason, I must have got distracted and went on to Bartholomew. But we're going to start with Thomas. What do we know about Thomas? That's usually the first thing we think about, isn't it? And he's a doubter. Why do we call him a doubter?
He had to see the marks in Jesus' hands.
Yeah, physically see.
See,
Yeah.
what he believed.
Jesus shows up to the other 10. Why only 10? Judas is dead already. Yep. So he shows up to the other 10. Thomas isn't there. And when the disciples get all excited and say, "We've seen Jesus, the Messiah. He's alive," Thomas says, "I ain't buying that. I don't believe it unless I can see the scars in his hands and scar in his side. I'm just not going to buy it." And so we all label poor old Thomas Doubting Thomas. I've always thought he's got sort of a bum rap. You know, I would suspect if we were in the same situation, and Jesus showed up to everybody but one of us, and everybody else said to that one, "We've seen Jesus, he's alive," I suspect most of us would say, "You got to be kidding. I just can't believe it. People don't come back from the dead like that. I got to see this to believe it." So, you know, Thomas gets a bad rap, I think, but certainly he has that name because Jesus then shows up next time they're together and he shows himself to Thomas, and Thomas said, "My Lord and my God." He obviously believes it when he sees it, which is why, as we said before, the disciples know better than anybody whether Jesus really did raise from the dead after he died on that cross. And for them to die, especially the kind of death most of them did die, just convinces me that they really saw Jesus. They really believed what they were preaching. He really did come back from the tomb and appear to them. I can't imagine people willingly doing what happened to them if they knew it was a lie. You know, if they hadn't seen Jesus and they're just making this up to fool people, they sure died some pretty ugly deaths to prove nothing, you know, to get nothing. They didn't make any money off of this. Like we said last week, maybe they didn't have a television contract. You know, they weren't asking people to send in $35 a week to support our program. They had nothing. You know, history knows most all of them died owning nothing except the clothes on their backs. And so for them to get out and preach that and die for that, to me, if you're trying to help people understand why we believe the Bible, that's got to be one of the top 2 or 3 reasons for why we believe the Bible to be true. It's written by men whose stories are told, who died for the stories they were telling. And I don't believe people would die for something they knew to be a lie. So it just doesn't make any sense. I'd rather think of Thomas, though, as opposed to doubting Thomas. I look at his courage. And in John chapter 11, verse 16, if you remember the story, Jesus is about to go back to Jerusalem. The disciples know he's in big trouble. He knows the crowds have been riled up against him. And Thomas says, as the disciples are trying to talk Jesus out of it, says, "Let us go so that we may die with him too." I mean, most people don't remember Thomas saying that or don't think about Thomas saying that. But that was pretty courageous of Thomas. You know, he just basically threw his hands up and said, "Okay, if Jesus is going, let's go with him. If he's going to be put to death, let's go die with him." Thomas is pretty bold, I think. None of the others said that. None of the others jumped up to say, "Let's go." Thomas is the one that says that. So I try to remember that about Thomas rather than remembering his doubts. Because like I say, I don't know that I would believe somebody if they were to say somebody I knew had died, that they saw them later. It doesn't make much sense to me. Thomas is believed to have died in 72 AD. So he's 10, 12 years going by after Paul starts doing his stuff. I don't think we mentioned last week, most people think Matthew was probably the first apostle to die after the Bible's closed. He dies about 60 AD, and everybody else sort of staggers after that. A lot of people between 60 and 65, and so we're some not quite 30 years after the church is established. A few of them live longer than that. Thomas, they generally say, died about 72 AD. Thomas has an interesting story. He's probably the one we have the best history about. It's not just tradition, but we actually have writings and stuff about him. He's believed to have gone to India. And there are many churches in India that profess to be Thomas churches. There's an ancient church there that's supposedly built around 400 AD, and it's purportedly there because Thomas took the gospel to India, preached to people in India. And when you think about the distance it travels, and we're going by foot or at best by horse, he's gone a long way. He's leaving Jerusalem, going to India. And the stories say he went all the way to the southern tip of India, preaching to people there, and then came back up through establishing the church there in India. Finally killed by a spear, which is the little symbol that you've got, is a spear, because he insulted one of the Hindu gods. They celebrate his death on July the 3rd. And that's the date they believe he died. And again, they know more about him probably than most of all these other guys we're going to talk about for some reason. Questions, thoughts, other comments about Thomas?
You know, if you think about the short period of time from Jesus' ministry and his resurrection in 72 AD, and how the word spread, and I mean, they must have done a good job.
You think?
Because
Yeah.
it stuck.
It did.
You know?
And especially Thomas, like I say, there are still churches in India with his name on them. There ain't any doubt in their mind Thomas showed up there, preached the gospel to them. And I think we touched on this last week. When Paul goes to Thessalonica, those people are all upset because the people that turned the world upside down have come here now. And I think you're absolutely right. You're talking 72 AD's, 40 years after 33 AD roughly. And by this time, they've pretty well covered the Roman Empire. And they're traveling by foot. They're traveling by slow horse if they're going by horseback. But they're not traveling more than 20, 30 miles a day probably. So you're talking months and months and months and years and years and years of traveling, going around simply trying to share this message that nobody'd ever heard before. In the face of everything everybody believed. The Jews were bad enough. They believed in Jehovah. They at least had the same God. But they weren't looking for Jesus to be that Messiah. They were looking for a totally different kind of Messiah. So they fought against the Jews. But then you've got all the rest of the world who have a plethora of gods. Well, they've got gods for everything. Gods for the house, gods for the outside, gods for their cows, like we're looking in Exodus. There's a God for everything in their life, especially the Hindu people. They had thousands of gods. They had a God for everything. God for your fingernails, God for your toenail. Seriously. They had gods for everything. And here comes these guys saying, we want to tell you about the one true God. All these other gods you're worshiping, they're really not. This is the one true God. And can you imagine well, you can't imagine, because that's why we're studying these guys. They're murdered for that. They're killed for that. They're beaten up for that. There are just all kinds of horrible things happen to them because they're trying to tell people about the God they saw die and who came back to life. And I suspect that's the only reason these people can do what they've done, is they saw Jesus alive. And it's just amazing to me as we study their stories, how sometimes we get so lackadaisical. We don't like sitting in church more than an hour and a half. I feel like I have to apologize on Sunday. If the sermon goes a little too long and we're there till 12:15 instead of noon, sorry to keep you so long.
I didn't hear anybody grumbling.
I didn't hear anybody grumbling either, but that's my mindset. I feel like I have to apologize because you're having to stay till 12:15 instead of noon, as though that's a horrible inconvenience for everybody. And you're right, Bob. Nobody complained. I'm just saying the way I felt. But these guys, they're traveling thousands of miles, leaving everybody. If they had family, I doubt they were taking family with them. Most of them probably didn't. But even still, they've left all their friends. They've left everything they knew. Going to lands they've never been to before, couldn't speak the language, just having to learn everything all over again in order to share the message of Jesus Christ with people.
I'm just wondering how they got there. There's no maps, there's no
There are no
road
maps,
signs,
yeah.
there's no,
Yeah.
I'm just gonna start walking this way.
That's right. I'm just going to
Well,
head east and
everybody
see where I
walked,
end
so
up.
there
And
were
see where they
probably
can-
trails,
What's that?
Well, and certainly
because
come-
everybody had to walk. and
Well,
everything.
yeah, but
Yeah.
I mean,
But
it's,
they didn't know where
it's
they were
like,
going.
I wonder how far I've left I've got,
Yeah.
you know, I'm usually 33 miles,
well, especially these guys.
25 miles the next exit.
Yeah, these guys, and you're right, it's 20, 25 miles a day that you're walking.
Kilometers over there.
I don't know what they were back then, clicks or
What'd you
something.
say?
Kilometers over there.
Yeah, I don't know what they were called back in these days, but you know, the roads of Rome ended when the empire stopped. They didn't build roads on into India and across that way, and you know, so once you get out of the Roman Empire, which a lot of these people were, you're right, there's probably footpaths and that's about it. Except there were huge caravans, remember, that were coming from the east, bringing all the spices and all the silks and all that stuff. So there would have been good caravan roads that the people would have brought their stuff with. But there's no rest stops along the way. You know, there's no law enforcement to keep you safe from the bandits and the bad guys and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I don't know what they did for restaurants and, you know, things to eat. Yeah, I mean, it's just, you think about that, they had a pretty tough life. But they did what God called them to do, go into all the world and preach the gospel. And these guys do. They go into all the world, known to them at the time. I mean, they didn't get to America, when America wasn't even heard of, you know, here. Didn't even know it existed. I thought the world was flat, you know, so they don't know where they're going or what they're going to end up or what they're going to run into. But most of them run into some pretty tough
That just puts it in
times.
better perspective when there was no conveniences. I
Yeah,
mean,
there weren't
and,
any.
you know,
Yeah.
and how far they were walking and where did they get their food
Sure.
in the 25 or
And what they paid for it with.
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just
No idea.
dirt.
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
Yeah, you just, I read these stories and I think, how do they ever do
And
this?
then go to talk about the gospel and they're getting shunned for
Yeah,
it. I mean,
and get killed for it, beat up for it, who knows all kinds of stuff for it. Paul, I can sort of understand, you know, sort of understand. Once he established the churches and there were churches for him to go to, he had a place he could knock on the door and say, hey, put me up for the night, you know, give me some money. But you know, when he's on his missionary journeys, and we'll talk about him in a bit of it, he didn't have those churches either. He was going from place to place, establishing churches, so he didn't have much, you know, and all the walking and traveling he did is still amazing. Other thoughts about Thomas. Thomas, this is the only tradition he has, is that he got stabbed with a sword over in India somewhere. Some people suspect that he and another guy who we'll talk about in a second carried Matthew's gospel to India and that it was in Hebrew. And most people suspect Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew first, and then it got translated into Greek, which was the primary language of the day. But some church traditions have Thomas bringing a copy of Matthew's gospel in Hebrew to the people in India. And again, that's tradition. All of this is tradition, because none of it's in the Bible, but it's there. Anything else about Thomas?
It says his other name was Didymus. Says,
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Thomas, also known
Yes.
as Didymus. Yeah.
Several people you'll see, and Bartholomew's the next one, he's got the same problem. Their names change all over the place. And when we look at a couple of these next ones, we're not even sure what their names are, except because they have so many, and they're called different people. So yeah, he's got another name. Not quite sure what that name means. Some of the scholars aren't really sure why he's called that. They're not really sure. But a lot of these guys have that happen. We see that in Scripture, that this guy was so-and-so, also known as such and such. And we, I suppose, can see that. You know, this is Bob, also known as Robert, also known as Mr. Gibson. Papa. I mean, he's got all kinds of names. And so my guess is that's what they were. They had nicknames, they had names they went by for some purposes, and then they had the names most of us know them by, which are their common popular names, I'll call it that, I suppose. Anything else? All right, Bartholomew's next. What do we know about Bartholomew?
2 names.
He has at least 2 names. What's his other one?
Nathaniel.
And why do we think his other name is Nathaniel?
John's gospel was there.
Yeah. Bartholomew is called Bartholomew in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He's called Nathaniel in John's. In fact, we have the guy going after him to get him and bring him back to Jesus. And Philip and Nathaniel go together in John's gospel. John never mentions anybody by the name of Bartholomew. So tradition says they're the same guys. All the lists have 12 people in them. And so if we're going to believe that the 12 are the same 12, then Nathaniel has to be Bartholomew somewhere along the way. Because that's the only place we hear about him is in John's gospel. Remember, John doesn't give us a list. And so we have to suppose that Nathaniel is Bartholomew, because other than that, we don't know. Nobody else calls him that. He could have been another guy, and John just doesn't give us a list, and he's just talking about Nathaniel for some reason. But most of the early church people believe he's probably the same guy. But we don't know for sure. What else we know about Bartholomew?
No deceit.
Pardon?
No deceit. Deceit.
If he's Nathaniel, correct.
Yeah.
Jesus says, here comes a guy in whom there is no deceit, as he sees him coming from laying underneath the tree. So he was a very moral fellow, presumably, if that's what that means. A good guy, honest, upright. For Jesus to say that about him, I'm presuming he had a pretty good reputation. That's what Jesus calls him, a man in whom there is no deceit. What else we know about him?
Well, I read about Bartholomew that he was in India also.
Yes.
In his trip, and the god Balda and others had fallen down and so on, so they beat him because the gods had fallen down. His god had taken over.
You know, and you read that, you see that in the Old Testament, you know, when the gods would fall down. If you remember when the Ark of the Covenant was seized by the Philistines and set up in their temple, the next morning they come up and the temple has fallen over, or the statue has fallen over. They're standing back up, we go the next day and it's fallen over and its head's broken off. And all kinds of horrible things going on, and so they say, get rid of this thing. But you read about those kinds of stories, how when God comes onto the scene, false gods take lumps. And most people who believe in those false gods get rather upset because they want to worship their God. They don't believe the God you're talking about. And so, yeah, that's why they're running into all this persecution, all this stuff going on to them, is because nobody believed them. Some traditions actually say Bartholomew went to India with Thomas. Again, these are all traditions. Nobody knows for sure that that's true. But he's there in India. He meets his death in several different places. One is, you can see that little blade, they believe he was skinned alive. I got a feeling that would hurt. You know, I don't even like to get a splinter in my finger or something. Can you imagine being tied somewhere and just having what they normally do is they would slice you right below your neck, slice you right below your neck in the back, and then they'd take a fillet knife and they would just peel your skin off. That just seems like that would hurt a lot. But that's one of the things they believe he died by. That's why that knife is there, because they believe that. Other traditions say that's not what happened to him. He actually was crucified somewhere, and again upside down, sort of like Peter was. And then a third tradition says he was knocked unconscious with stones, and then thrown into the water and drowned, which is why that little water scene is there. They're not really sure what happened to him.
But what was, I read where the reasoning behind it was because he converted the king to Christianity?
That's one of these guys. Is it this guy?
I thought it was Bartholomew.
I don't have him. Somewhere there was one of them that converted the king's wife, proconsul's wife, and so they persecuted him for that. I don't have that in my notes. I'm not saying that's not correct.
I'm trying to find it.
Okay, you look for that for me. Don't know much else about him. Other than that, he's not a very popular guy as far as the Bible writers are concerned. Again, they think he went to India. They believe he went there with Thomas. Some believe he also took Matthew's gospel. So somebody's making copies of these things. And again, just a horrible, horrible way to end up dying.
Okay, I found where it says, he is said to have been martyred for having converted Apollonius, king of Armenia, in
Okay.
Christianity.
Okay, and that could very well be correct. Again, there's several traditions about different guys. It's all tradition, it's all church history. There are no inspired writings other than James, who we know, Judas, I suppose. But other than that, we're really not sure. But what we're pretty sure of, everybody but John died being a martyr, because that's all the traditions agree to that kind of stuff.
It's kind of funny, the Old Testament, though, there were examples of where the conflict with God and the people lived and were successful. We've just been dealing with Exodus,
Yep.
and then you look at Baal, you mentioned Baal, something like that happened, our God won, and they didn't get killed.
Well, the prophets of Baal got killed. They got slaughtered by them, by Isaiah or whoever that was. Killed all those guys. But of course, if you look, Paul, at the Old Testament, there are all these battles between the Israelites and the other nations, and the primary thing they're fighting over is whose God's going to win. Every nation had a God. Many of them had more than one God. And so if you look at it that way, if you look at they're fighting over whose God's going to take, that's why David's fighting Goliath, remember? His cry is, how dare you allow this uncircumcised guy to profane our God? Who does he think he is? It didn't bother him that he was out there beating up the Israelites. He was angry because he was profaning God. And so a lot of the battles in the Old Testament were God battles. And a lot of Israelites died in some of those battles, obviously. But you're right, the prophets didn't die that often, although some of them did too. And of course, a lot of Christians aren't dying either. Even though a lot of Christians did die and were martyred, like we read last week, a lot of them didn't die. A lot of Christians kept on living. That's why the church kept growing. More and more and more Christians all the time. But these guys who were the mouthpieces, who were causing most of the trouble, if you can say it that way, most all of them ended up being martyred for what they believed. Which again, to me, is just amazing and a witness for the fact that what happened was probably true. How about James, the son of Alphaeus? What do we know about him?
Might be Matthew's brother.
Say again?
He might be Matthew's brother.
Okay, he might be Matthew's brother. And we talked about that. He's probably not. And we think probably not, because he's never mentioned by Matthew as being his brother, and he gives us a list. And where's Matthew's list at?
10, 2,
Dr.
4.
Pepper.
Very good, 10, 2, and 4. But he doesn't list him as his brother, which you would think if you were Matthew and you were listing the apostles, and this guy was your brother, you'd probably say, and my brother. Why do we think he might be his brother?
Because they're both Levites?
Mike?
They're both Levites?
No.
Levites?
Better reason.
Their last name?
Yeah, they both have the same last father's name. Levi is the son of Alphaeus. And if we accept that Levi is Matthew, they got the same last name, same father's name, put it that way. But of course, that wasn't an unpopular name. A lot of people named Alphaeus in those days. And so, that's just one of those quirks. They both have the same dad's name. But again, I think if it was Matthew's brother, he probably would have said, this, by the way, this is my brother. Somewhere along the way, it had more to say about him than he does, which is absolutely nothing.
Wasn't he also, wasn't it possible he is also Jesus' brother? Is this
Jesus
right,
had a James, yes. But this is James the son of Alphaeus, so he can't be James the son of Joseph, because he's got the Alphaeus last name. James, who wrote the book of James, they believe was Jesus' half-brother, not the same James. Part of the problem is we have a lot of James in the New Testament. We got James, the son of Zebedee, John's brother, and then we got James, the son of Alphaeus, and then we got James, the half-brother of Jesus. So we've got at least 3 Jameses in the New Testament, and sometimes that leads to confusion. And if you do much Bible study and reading on who's writing what books, you'll find some people who will say the book of James was written by the Apostle James. He probably wasn't, because he dies in Acts chapter 12. So he doesn't live very long to be writing the book of James. So he probably wasn't the James who wrote the book of James. Most scholars suggest that's Jesus' brother, half-brother, who does that. Not James, the son of Alphaeus. But that's part of the confusion, is there's more than one James. Primary tradition for him, Josephus reported, and Josephus wrote, remember he's writing in this time span, so I suspect what he says should carry a lot of weight with us, because he's living right then, writing this stuff. Many of these traditions we get aren't written till 400 or 500 AD, hundreds of years after these people have died. But Josephus actually says that James the son of Alphaeus was stoned and then clubbed to death, which is why that little mallet-looking thing's up there. But there's another, and he went to Syria, by the way, so he's not very far from home. He's a little north of Jerusalem, up in the Syria area, where he goes and gets stoned and then clubbed to death. But there's another tradition that he went to Egypt and was crucified down in Egypt. That's an older tradition, older meaning more recent, older from the days of Jesus out. But I sort of accept what Josephus says for what that's worth, because he's writing at this time span and probably would have been the one to know what was going on. He doesn't mention most of the guys, but he does mention this one. And so I suspect he heard something, and that's why he put it in his book. What else do we know about James the son of Alphaeus? Anything? Not a lot. The Bible doesn't say much about him. He's one of those almost anonymous people who the Bible doesn't say anything about at all, except he's in the list of the disciples. Next one's Simon the Zealot. We talked about him last week, I think, a little bit about how you've got Matthew, the tax collector, on one side, Simon the Zealot, who's totally against Rome. He's willing to fight, he's willing to kill the Romans to get freedom, and they're both disciples. They're both ones of the 12, and they're sitting around the same table. Here's this guy that's betrayed the Jews by becoming a Roman tax collector. And here you've got this guy over here who would kill all the Jews or all the Romans if he could get away with it. He's a zealot, if we accept that that's why he's being called that. And so sitting around that table must have been fun. Debbie's watching the video of the show, The Chosen, and she told me that that they played that. Those guys have those words in this clip, that they've got this conflict between James and Matthew, as you would well believe would be there, considering what you've got. It'd be like a strong Trump supporter and a strong Biden supporter, being in the same group, and everybody knows it. And you would have some interesting conversations, I suspect. Like James the son of Alphaeus, we don't know much about Simon. Not a whole lot in there other than his nickname. He doesn't have anything else to do much with the Bible. Some people suspect, in order to give him a break, that he's called Simon the Zealot because he's so zealous for Jesus. I don't think that works. He's no more zealous than Peter and James and John and some of the others. And so why they would name him Simon the Zealot as though Peter wasn't zealous for Jesus doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But that's one of the writings I came across. He supposedly goes to Persia and is killed after refusing to sacrifice something to the sun god. Stories, and again, you see three options up there. One is he was crucified. And I've got a list of some of these. Earliest records of his death, they don't come until several centuries after that. And so it's hard to decide. In the 5th century, a guy named Moses of Shoreen wrote that he was martyred in the kingdom of Iberia. Anybody have a clue where Iberia is? I didn't either, so I had to look it up. It's modern day Georgia, which is Ukraine area, up in that area. So he goes up there according to tradition. The Golden Legend, which is a really cool history book. It's a story written about 1250 or so AD by this guy who wrote all these things about early Christianity. It's called the Golden Legend. He says he was martyred in Persia in about 65 AD. Ethiopian Christians believe he was crucified in Samaria, which is why the cross is there. Another account says he was crucified in 61 AD in Britain. Goes all the way to Britain to die over there. In the 16th century, so we're getting way, way far away from stuff. A guy named Justus Lipsius claims that he was sawn in half, which is why that saw is there. And then Eastern Church tradition, which is Greek Orthodox stuff, suggests he died of old age in Edessa. And so you've got several different options for Simon the Zealot. They're really not sure how he died, but everybody agrees he was martyred, whichever way it was. So again, he gave up his life for Jesus. Anything, questions, comments about Simon?
I saw he was born in Galilee.
Probably. Had luck.
Read that. I mean, of course, like you said, given what you how he died and so on down here, you don't know.
You have no idea. Yeah, and most of these guys are Judean, they're Galilean. They're all from that area, which again is what makes their journeys that they go on so much more amazing. Most of them, I would suspect, had been 40 or 50 miles from their hometown their whole life. And here Jesus dies and gives them this great commission, and they travel thousands of miles, places they'd never been to, had no idea where they were going, no road maps to follow, no AAA to help them along the way, nothing. And they just get up and start walking, like Mo said, 20 miles today, 15 miles tomorrow. I'm pooped, I can only do 5 next day, just wherever they went, but they went to talk about Jesus, so it's still pretty cool to me. What about Thaddeus? What do you know about Thaddeus?
Son of James.
Say again?
Son of James.
Son of James, okay. Where am I at? He's another guy that's got lots of names.
Yeah, he does.
He's probably got more than anybody else that we've got. He's actually called Judas, the son of James, in one of the list, which is in John chapter 14. John writes, "Then Judas, not Judas Iscariot, said, 'But Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world?'" Jesus has shown up to them. He's in the upper room. They're doing the Lord's Supper stuff, and Jesus says, there's a time coming when I'm going to reveal myself to you, but the rest of the world's not going to get to see me. And the only words we have that Thaddeus, assuming Judas, son of James, is Thaddeus, says is, "Why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world?" That's all we get out of Thaddeus. The whole Bible, that's the whole stuff we get from him. He's listed in Matthew and Mark as Thaddeus, but in the King James Version, he's called Labbaeus, Labdeus, or something like that. So again, he's got another name, and nobody really knows for sure, but if the list are all the 12 guys, and all the different names are all of the same people, then he's got several different names. But interesting. What else? Actually, Jerome, who was a 4th century Bible scholar, calls him Trinomius. Which means 3 names. Tri being 3, nomius being Latin for name. So he's referred to by Jerome, who was a great Bible scholar of the 4th century, as Trinominus, meaning a man of 3 names. Which I guess, okay, whatever. You gotta call him something, I suppose. He's believed to have died with an axe chopped up. Church tradition says he founded a church in Edessa and died there as a martyr. One legend says he died in Persia. Believing most of the stories say he was executed by either an axe or a club, and so that's why the axe is there, showing that's how he dies. Article I read said after his execution, his body is said to have been brought to Rome and placed in St. Peter's Basilica, where his bones remain to this day in the same tomb as the remains of Simon the Zealot. A lot of church history about these guys, what happens to their bones after they're dead. Catholic Church maintains they've got a bunch of them in there in the Vatican somewhere.
Can't do the DNA because there's nothing to compare the DNA.
No way of knowing. No way of knowing. There's no brush.
Yeah.
There's no brush with hair pieces on it. There's no cup that they drank out of that we can compare DNA with. So there's no way of knowing. Somebody asked last week, I think maybe it was Mo, why don't we know more about who these guys are and where they're buried and all this kind of stuff? And my thought really has been, God doesn't want us worshiping these guys. He doesn't want us making monuments to them and honoring them and worshiping them as somebody really special. Jesus is who we're supposed to worship. I think we can read about them, we can admire them, But I'm afraid they figured, Jesus probably figured, God probably knew, if we had tombs where these guys really were, we'd be making pilgrimages to them. We'd be spending thousands upon thousands of dollars to make sure the building stayed under construction and all that kind of stuff. I don't think we need to know what happened to these people. I don't think it's our worry, where are their bones at. The Roman Catholic Church has that worry, and they maintain they've got a lot of bones from the old apostles hiding there in the Vatican somewhere. Whether that's true or not, nobody really knows, and it doesn't really make any difference. But Thaddeus is one strange fellow because he has so many names. We're not really sure. Probably, though, the guy we know least about at all is this guy Matthias. What do we know about Matthias?
He replaced Judas.
We do know that, don't we? He replaced Judas.
Iscariot,
Yes.
not the other.
That's right, Judas I. Because in Acts chapter 1, Peter says, there's some ancient prophecy that says you got to replace the 12 or whatever that verse says. And so they cast lots between Matthias and another guy. The lots fall on Matthias. He gets numbered with the 12. That's the last we hear about Matthias. He's not anywhere in the Bible. He gets a couple of verses, and then he's gone. We really know that.
He died real quick.
Whether he died quick or not, we don't know. We just don't know what happened to him. We got a few estimates. They suspect that he was stoned in Jerusalem and then beheaded, which is why that rock and the guillotine is there. Always seems sort of strange. Some of these guys die like they get killed, and then horrible things happen to them after they die, which sort of seems to defeat the purpose. But that's really about all we know about him. They believe he went to the area of modern-day Georgia as well and died up there. That's another tradition, contrary to the one that says he got stoned to death in Jerusalem. So we really don't know much what happened to him.
I'm reading where it says he became one of the patron saints for alcoholics.
For alcoholics.
That's what it says.
Really?
I have no idea why that would be true. We don't know anything about Matthias. I would have thought, if anything, he'd be a patron saint for gamblers. Because they cast lots to choose him. And I guess you could facetiously say the Bible.
Patronage, alcoholics, carpenters, tailors.
I have no idea why, because the Bible says absolutely nothing about Matthias. We don't know where he came from, don't know what he did, don't know why he was chosen, other than the lots were cast. And tradition gives him dying in a couple of spots. There's one final tradition that says he died of old age in Jerusalem. So this one, nobody really knows for sure what happened to Matthias. He's one of the few that think, well, maybe he didn't die a martyr. If you notice, we've got a couple others in there as well that maybe died of old age, but probably not. Questions about any of those? That completes the 12 plus 1.
This is what it says,
Okay.
just to share it.
Sure.
It says, based on his experiences with the Lord, he was able to abstain from legitimate pleasures in order to control the lower passions. Subsequently, he became one of the patron saints for alcoholics.
Who says that?
I know.
Where you getting that?
How do you know
That's
that?
Google.
dummies.com for religion.
Okay, dummies.com. Well, if you believe that, that's probably what we are. All this stuff is tradition. There's nothing in the Bible, obviously, about that. There aren't any written records of what happened to Matthias. How they come up with that, I have no idea. I saw absolutely nothing that would support that while I was doing my studying for this class. Best I can find is nobody has a clue what happened to him, not even sure how he died, much less how he lived. But if somebody needs a patron saint to help them overcome some of that stuff, more power to them. If they want to look to Matthias and say, there's my example for not being a drunk every day, he's living on in somebody's memory today, so it makes him worthwhile. We do know he replaced Judas, as you said. But other than that, we really don't know much about him. Questions about any of those 11 at all, or other comments or thoughts? All right, the next guy is Paul. Probably the guy we know the most about in the Bible of all these guys we're looking at. Paul calls himself an apostle. He says he was an apostle called by God. The word apostle actually only means being someone who's sent. And so obviously Paul was chosen by God to be an apostle to the Gentiles. chosen by God and sent to various places. So in that sense, he fits the description of an apostle. He wasn't one of the 12 or the 11 or 13, but he came along later. What was his primary task?
Preach to the Gentiles.
Yes, God appointed him to preach to the Gentiles. He was the guy that took the message there. He wasn't the first, I don't think, because Peter was. Probably. Remember, Peter goes to Cornelius, and God has to convince Peter with that vision of the sheep with all the animals in it, some clean, some unclean. We talked about this last week, I think. To go, the Gentiles can get the gospel. And so Peter goes, but Paul is specifically chosen to be the Gentiles to the or the apostle to the Gentiles. And how many missionary journeys does he take?
5.
Probably 5. 3 that we know of in the Bible. Tradition says he probably took a couple of more. Remember when he writes to the letter to Rome, he said, I want to stop by on my way there and go to Spain. And so some people think he actually got to France and Spain. The Bible doesn't talk about it. There's another one, small one, that he probably took to Rome on another time. And so a lot of people think he took 5. The Bible talks about 3. And the way you remember that is Acts 13, 16, and 19. So you got 3 numbers, 3, okay? And those are the missionary journeys. He covers a lot of what is modern-day Turkey. Also gets into Greece. Finally gets to Rome. And if he got to Spain and France, he does a lot of traveling too. And he doesn't just go once. He isn't like some of these other guys, Matthew or somebody, or Thomas, who goes from Jerusalem to India and dies there. Paul just keeps going on a circuit. I mean, he's just walking and traveling and going by boat all over what would then be known as the Roman Empire. The greatest walker and traveler of all these guys. Established churches everywhere. His primary job, as Emily said, was to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. And in doing that, he gives us how many books of the Bible? 13. 13. Gives us 13 books. 14 if you want to count Hebrews, which is up in the air. But certainly 13. And there are stories about what we're supposed to be doing as Christians. You know, they're not history books like Acts or the Gospels even. There are doctrinal books. There are books telling us how we're supposed to live, what the gospel of Jesus Christ looks like with boots on the ground. You know, what are we supposed to do day by day by day? How do we treat people? How do we act? What do we do with ourselves? Over and over, all these things. Things Christians should know, how we're supposed to apply these things. He mentions a lot of people in his writings. He obviously was a well-known, gregarious kind of fellow because he names all kinds of people in his writings. Say hi to these people, say hi to those people. These people send greetings to you. A lot of people knew Paul. But he does a whole lot of traveling, a whole lot of walking all over the place. His conversion is somewhat different from others. You know, he's a persecutor of the church. He's on his way to Damascus to arrest people, haul them back to Jerusalem. We got letters from the Jewish authorities to haul these people back to jail. And he runs into Jesus on the way to Damascus. A bright light blinds him. Voice comes out of the cloud saying, you know, why are you kicking against me? And Paul says, who are you? And Jesus says, I'm Jesus, you know, who you're persecuting. And Paul becomes an instant believer. He's led into the city. Ananias is told by God, go see Paul. He's over here on this street called Straight. He's waiting on you. Ananias says, not on the hair of my chin, I'm not going over there. Because I know who Paul is, or Saul at this time. He's a persecutor. He's going to arrest me and throw me in jail. And Ananias did not want to go. And God says, you need to go. I've appointed him to be a special envoy for me. Just get on over there. So he goes, talks to Paul, ends up after Paul accepts what's going on, and says, you know, why do you, Paul says in one of his Acts examples, and Ananias says to him, why do you tarry, arise and be baptized and wash away your sins? Another indication that early disciples, when they accepted Jesus Christ, one of the first things they did was get baptized. You know, join Jesus in that symbolic act of baptism, death, burial, and resurrection to symbolize your faith in Jesus Christ. And so Paul does, spends the rest of his life traveling around the world preaching Jesus to people. They think he was put in jail in about the years 64 to 67. The book of Acts ends with him in jail. but they think, most tradition says he got out after that, and that's when he went on some of his other journeys. And then he came back to Rome, and that's when he was arrested by Nero and ultimately killed there under Neroan persecution. Tradition says somewhere around 68 AD he's beheaded in either May or June. Nero kills himself according to history June the 9th, 68 AD. So Paul would have died before that if he dies in Nero's persecutions. Thinking Paul was probably around 60, 65 years old by this time, which is living to be a good old age for these guys. 2 Timothy chapter 4 says, and this is Paul writing to Timothy, which most people believe is probably the last book he writes. He says, as for me, I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Paul, when he's writing this, is apparently aware he's about to die. Whatever situation he's in now when he's writing 2 Timothy, he's back in jail. He's about to be executed, and I think he knows it. Paul gets a pretty tough life. He's one of those guys that gives up a lot. He's a highfalutin prophet, Pharisee of the Jewish sect, taught by all kinds of the greatest teachers and scholars. Probably would have been a Sanhedrin member had he lived long enough and not accepted Jesus. I mean, he was going to be somebody really important. He gives all of that up to accept Jesus Christ. Paul.
You sit and think about, I mean, to me, you sit and think about the fact that you admire these people. They gave up all their wealth, went out there knowing that they have a hard life and so on. So they didn't take any extra clothing with them, or they didn't take food with them, stuff like that, and all getting killed. And yet they preached Christ. I mean, even ones that, after Christ died, and they had several that died in the 60s, but there was other people who went on further than that, even they knew that people died, so they still did. And today, you look at the missionaries that went to South America several years ago, and they got killed in South America.
Yep.
Type of thing. They still did it. You admire people like that.
Yeah, there's still people dying. In some article I read the end of 1900s, was that more people died in the century 1990 to 1999 than have died all the time, in all of time. And when you think about that, when you think about all these people who have died, that more people died in that time span than have died all the previous time. Christian people being persecuted around this world, dying for their faith. Persecution is still alive and well. A lot of Christians being killed every single day, simply because they're out trying to preach the gospel to people who don't hear it. And they've got some great people to follow as examples by are these people that died in that first century as well.
The thing that I think that we overlook is that not only was Paul preaching and starting churches and teaching people to be elders and all of that stuff, he was a tent maker too.
Yeah, he worked his way
He
around.
worked his way. I mean, he had to work for a living.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
he didn't just sit around.
He makes that a point in some of his writings. I wasn't a burden on any of you people. I worked. And so he didn't require churches to pay him. He had a job.
Paid his own way.
He paid his own way. So he's, not only is he working himself, but he's out doing all this stuff in his spare time.
But today, people that want to join or become missionaries and give up all their
A lot of people still do.
stuff
Yep.
are looked upon by normal people. You want to say
Yeah.
normal?
What a crazy guy.
What a stupid person.
Yeah, why would you do that? Yeah, what's wrong with you? And I share the story sometimes about they're not here anymore. I had some mother come to me one day and said, my son's thinking about going to seminary. Wants to be a preacher. Would you talk him out of that? I said, no, I don't think I want to talk him out of that. If that's really what he wants to do, we need to be praying about it to see if that's what God wants him to do. But you're right, Elvis. Most people look at that and think, you don't want to do that. Why would you? You can do a whole lot better off, go get a good job, paying lots of money, and support somebody else. Most people don't want their children going to these foreign lands, or their parents, or their siblings, or anybody else. That's still true. And yet Paul gives up everything he's got, and he lists the things he gave up in a couple
He
of
was
spots.
very prestigious.
That's what. He was
High
not.
ranking.
He wasn't a nobody like most of these other guys were. Paul got letters from the powers in Jerusalem to go arrest these people. He's a pretty important fellow.
But look, I mean, look at God's plan. He took
Yes.
nobodies and made them,
Somebody.
you know,
They did.
somebodies, and
Yep.
he took somebody and made him nobody to
Yep.
make him somebody again, you know?
And Paul writes that. Remember, he writes in one of his passages, all this stuff I gave up, I count as dung. You know, none of it matters for the sake of Jesus Christ. And that's what we need to look at. You know, the things we think we have to give up, the things we have to not do, the things we're missing out on, we think, we need to realize they don't really count as anything if we're doing what God wants us to do. And Paul's a great example of that. No question about it. Not ashamed of his life. You know, a couple of sad spots in his writing. He writes in 2 Timothy chapter 4, at my first offense, nobody came to my support. Everybody deserted me. Now, can you imagine? Here's this guy that's given up everything he owned. He's in prison, probably about to die. And he has to write in a letter to Timothy, nobody helped me. Everybody deserted me. You know, and my guess is, as he's writing that, and this is just my guessing, he's thinking about Jesus hanging on that cross. Everybody deserts him. You know, when you're about to be killed, most people are thinking, oh, I think I got laundry drying or something. I need to go get a hair wash or something. You know, something. I got to do something to get away from you because I don't want to die with you. Which again, when you remember some of the readings from last week, some of these guys, as they're being led to their execution, are still preaching, still talking to their captors about Jesus, and some of the captors are converted, and the story says they end up dying with him right then and there. You know, they change their mind and say, I want to accept Jesus, knowing good and well that accepting Jesus meant you're going to follow this guy to the head chopping off place or wherever. And they did it anyway.
That's pretty convincing.
A lot of courage.
Pretty convincing.
Pretty convincing. Amazing. Yeah, those guys, and a lot of them, you remember Andrew, he's hanging on that cross, and he's there for 2 days, tradition says, and all that 2 days he's preaching the gospel. Everybody who walks by, he's telling them about Jesus, trying to convince people who he was.
A more recent example, if you look what happened in World War II, this is the Jewish people in Germany.
Well, yeah.
7 million of them got killed.
Yep. Of course, they weren't Jesus believers,
No.
but you know, there's prejudice everywhere. It doesn't matter what part of the world you live in, somebody don't like you. Everybody has to be better than somebody else. And so you got to find somebody to pick on, and the Germans figured it'd be the Jews. Well, not just the Jews. They killed
the Germans
gypsies,
picked on everybody.
They killed everybody that wasn't blonde and white,
Right, exactly.
basically.
Homosexuals, gypsies,
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Jews.
They had the elite race. You know, if you weren't Aryan, you weren't anybody, and they really didn't care. But humanity is evil. I mean, that's why we need Jesus. You know, it's because left to our own devices, we're pretty mean people. We can be pretty ugly. We need Jesus to help get us the way we're supposed to go. Questions about Paul? I mean, we could talk about Paul forever if you wanted to. He has a lot to tell us. I'm sure we'll cover him a lot when we get to the New Testament survey class. Timothy's the next guy. What do you know about Timothy?
He's an understudy of Paul.
Okay, that's a good way to put it. He's an understudy of Paul. Paul calls him his son in the faith. And if you read through his books, Paul's letters to him, Paul obviously loved this guy like a son. You know, very close to him. He knew his mom, knew his mother or his grandmother. Timothy's obviously got a great relationship with Paul, and Alice, that's a good way to put it. He's Paul's understudy. Paul gives him assignments, sends him out places, tells him to go take care of stuff. In 1 Timothy, he sends him to Ephesus and tells him, you know, strengthen the church there, do all these things you're supposed to do, battle false teachings. Timothy paid for that kind of relationship, unfortunately. Tradition says he died in Ephesus, where he was complaining to some people about celebrating a pagan feast. And they decided they didn't want to hear that anymore. And so they beat him to death with clubs.
But he was the bishop of Ephesus.
He was a bishop of Ephesus in the church. He had a lot of clout as far as Christianity is concerned. But obviously a bishop then didn't mean as much as a bishop means today, because he still dies, tradition says, about 97 AD. So he's almost made it to the end of the first century. He's probably the oldest guy next to Titus and John as far as these early Bible people, but he's a lot younger than them because Paul brings him to the faith. Well, Timothy's a younger fellow, and so he's a lot younger than the rest of the guys we're reading about. He's mentioned in Fox's Book of Martyrs, again saying that the pagans were on celebrating a feast. They were in a procession, and he sort of reminds me, remember the guy I read about last week who jumps into the gladiator pit, and he's trying to make these gladiators stop fighting, and they end up killing him because of that, and because of that, they stopped the gladiator fight. So people realized, this is barbaric and we need to stop doing this. Timothy does about the same thing. There's a religious procession going down the road to celebrate some pagan god. Timothy gets in the way and stops them and basically tells them, you guys are being ridiculous. Your God's not real. Why would anybody worship this thing? And they decided they don't want to hear that, so they beat him with clubs and he ends up dying. Again, this is all tradition. The Bible doesn't say anything about it. He lives quite a while. He's up at 97 AD. So my guess is he knew John because John's from Ephesus. John goes back to Ephesus after he gets off the Isle of Patmos. So John probably knew him. Any other thoughts about Timothy? He gets 2 books written to him. Last one's Titus. What do we know about Titus? Nothing.
Goes to Crete.
He's a Greek, right?
He also-
Timothy apparently was at least half Greek, but yeah, Titus is Greek. What else? Albus's comment about Timothy probably works for him as well. He's an understudy of Paul. Paul runs across him and sort of brings him under his wings as well. Gets a book written to him to go to where did he go? Where is Titus at? Crete. He's in Crete. And Paul sends a letter to him, says, I left you there to take care of all this stuff. So Titus is a faithful follower of Paul, learns a lot from him, travels on some of his journeys, does a lot of stuff. He goes to the church at Corinth and serves the church there, according to 2 Corinthians 8. Paul takes him with him. He's hoped to meet Titus, and Troas has to wait for him. He's not there. Titus finally finds Paul, and they get back together. And they end up in Crete, as we said, and he ends up, according to tradition, he stays there and dies of old age. He's one of the few of the main Bible guys who isn't executed. Titus lives to be an old man. Question about him. Not a whole lot more we know about him other than that. The Bible doesn't say a lot. According to tradition, he was 94 years of age when he died. He's buried in Crete somewhere. So his festival is the 25th of August. That's just right around the corner. If we want to have a Titus party, we could have a Titus party.
And his skull is in the Church of St. Titus at Heraclon, Crete. That's all that's left of it.
That's all that's left. Okay.
The skull.
Just the skull's all that's left.
Any other questions about any of these guys? Titus supposedly went to Yugoslavia, that area, what is called Yugoslavia. So he does a lot of traveling as well after Paul gets a hold of him. But he ends up being sent to Crete by Paul, and tradition says he stayed there after we read that little book of Titus and dies there. And that concludes this study. I hope you got something out of this. I find it fascinating to read about these early Christian people and see what they went through and the things they had to put up with and what happened to most of them. Again, most of it's tradition. Nothing in the Bible really talking about what happened to them. But they're good examples for us to see what you're willing to put up with in order to live for Jesus. I appreciate you being here. I say we won't meet again until Monday night, the 20th, and if you're going to be an afternoon person, what day will it be?
23rd.
2 o'clock on Thursday, so we're flipping the times. And so you guys will get the second class if you come to the Thursday class. If you don't want to be here Monday night, you'll get the rerun of the Monday night class. But usually you get more stuff Because it seems like we add a little stuff by the time I get to Thursday night. So if that's true, stories that we've been able to look through and think about, these people who gave their lives serving you, whether they died a martyr or died of old age, God, they spent their life serving you. And our prayer is that we would do that. That wherever you want us to be, whatever you want us to do, wherever you want us to go, we would say yes to you and do whatever it is we feel led by your Spirit to do. God, I pray that you'd give us all the boldness and faith exhibited by all these people that we've looked at, so that hardships and struggles and inconveniences wouldn't slow us down or make us stop, but that we'd put you first in our lives. Thank you for being here today. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you all.